Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic. I'm an industrial and organizational psychologist, and my background is in using assessment tools and data, including analytics and AI, to understand and predict human behavior at work. And I'm joined today by my colleague and friend, Dr. Ben Dattner. Hi, Ben. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Good to be here. Thanks very much. Ben Dattner, founder of Dattner Consulting, LLC, and a practitioner of organizational psychology.
Thank you, Ben. And so we thought we'll spend some time today discussing one of the most exciting but also concerning areas at the interface between humans and technology, which is the brave new world of artificial intelligence, data analytics, and what implications that has for careers, talent, employability, our ability to manage ourselves and others. And I'll start with a little bit of background on this, which pertains how I personally got interested in this area. As some of you will know, we have had assessment tools like psychological screening tools or psychometric tests for over a century, and these assessments have been used quite effectively to accurately and ethically predict what people are likely to do, whether they are a good or a poor or an okay match for certain careers. And in the last couple of decades, increasingly, they've also have been used to help people understand themselves better and increase their self-awareness. So enter the digital revolution, and we find ourselves in a very interesting but different situation, which is that there is now so much data being produced on us everywhere by us. So we're constantly streaming. Even before the pandemic, even before this health crisis, we were probably behaving more online than offline, that a lot of computer scientists and AI experts have in the last decade or so teamed up with IO psychologists to see to what degree we can actually understand and predict human behavior without relying on traditional assessment tools and leveraging some of these new types of data or footprint. And Ben, do you want to give some examples of what these emerging new talent signals or technological innovations are?
Sure. So people say that information and data is the equivalent of oil in the digital age, in the current times that we're living in. And so there's the question, who captures the value of that data? Who collects that data? How do they collect that data? How do they utilize that data? And who are the beneficiaries of that data? And just over the last couple of days, 4 of the leaders from the large tech companies have been testifying before Congress. So it's very much in the news. What information is gathered? Is that information gathered in a transparent, ethical way? Do people know that they are sharing that information? And then who benefits from that information? And the privacy laws in Europe and some of the laws in California represent sort of social and political movements to reallocate the benefits of that data.
And so one of the questions that historically has concerned industrial organizational psychologists is really whether any type of data, particularly new data or tool for predicting human behavior, is accurate and valid, right? So, and today there are really not so many independent scientific studies that have compared the accuracy of, let's say, traditional personality assessments or traditional IQ tests, intelligence tests, the resume, structured and unstructured interviews, all these established, well-established methods with some of the new tools. But we know that a growing number of organizations are gravitating towards these innovative ways of capturing data. And so if we think of these new tools as sort of a potentially new talent signals, new indicators of whether someone has certain interests, values, personalities, competencies, etc., the question really is, what do these scores predict? Whether they can also help us understand people or not, and whether they can be deployed in an ethical way or not. And to give some examples that people might be familiar with, so historically, psychometric assessments, and that's still the case today, have been very, very long. In the last 5 or 10 years, a lot of new tech vendors have gamified or use game-based assessments that are shorter, more interactive, where you have to immerse yourself in an experience that has incorporated elements of games, video games, or game-like features. So for example, instead of asking you, are you a risk taker, yes or no, or on a 1 to 10 point scale, what is your risk profile, you have to decide when to stop a self-inflatable balloon. And the more it inflates, the more money you make, but if you go over limit, you get zero. Right, so that's a known classical psychological task that, with the help of now, modern computing, has been deployed at scale. Another example, of course, is video interviews. In the last 4 months, almost all of the interviews that were happening in person were at some point transferred to Zoom, Hangout, Teams, etc. And mostly it was humans watching these interviews to infer. For example, I'm looking at Ben now. I'm trying to infer if he's bored, if he wants to talk, if he's interested, if he's thinking about what the rest of the day looks like. But imagine having AI or algorithms that are scraping these data in the background to identify and interpret these signals. Yet another example is mining all the data that we have already given away to social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. TikTok is now a very interesting case study, of course, because the battle for data privacy is based predominantly, at least in theory, on what information could be derived from that data and whether that information can make a company or a country too powerful. And then there's also been a lot of advancements in profiling people's speech and voice. A lot of interesting research coming from the military that has not just tried to identify whether people are nervous, anxious, happy, sad, surprised through their voice, but actually what their personality is. And imagine that you can just profile the physical properties of your voice and get a sense of who you are or what you're like or how you compare to others. And then finally, maybe metadata, which rose to fame in 2013 with the Snowden saga and the NSA. The fact that just knowing people's locations and their patterns of communications, not the content, but the context, can help you understand who they are, whether they are, a risk to others, a risk to themselves, or whether they are, not worthy of further examination and snooping.
And for the purposes of the articles that we've written together, which you can find on Harvard Business Review, as Tomas is saying, it's kind of a very complex ecosystem that we're thinking about. And for an HR audience, it's helpful to think about HR's perspective, the hiring manager's perspective, the vendor or the technology's perspective, and then the digital footprints that can be accessed and interpreted and evaluated, that perspective. So there are many different sort of constituencies and source of information. And for an HR audience, it's helpful to think, what are the goals that you're optimizing for, and how can you use new technologies in an ethical way to do that? And how can you make sure that the hiring managers that you're supporting are also doing that in an ethical and legal manner? Because sometimes those things are opposed. We could make very accurate predictions about you if we were able to get a sample of your DNA or get access to your medical records or your mental health records, or have information about your family situation or things like that. Now, clearly those things would be predictive of certain aspects of somebody's performance and ability to expend effort and their work-life balance and all of those things, but you can't use that information. And one of the things that Tomas and I have written about is how certain things that are not legal in the traditional view of selection assessments haven't yet been deemed to be illegal in the new regimen. So for example, the Employee Polygraph Protection Act says that except for certain sensitive professions or roles like law enforcement or military or things like that, you cannot use a polygraph, a lie detector test, in order to evaluate a candidate. And so, okay, everybody says that's well and good, it's settled law, etc. But as Tomas was saying, if software can analyze your tone of voice or your body language or your digital footprints and ascertain how truthful you are in general, or whether you're telling the truth about in your answer to a particular question, that's in a way a backdoor manner that companies can access the same information about you that they couldn't legally access through a polygraph test. Or medical information also can't be utilized in a selection assessment, but given the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is now celebrating its 30th anniversary. However, what if software could ascertain your genetic disposition to illnesses, substance abuse, etc.? So one of the things we've talked about is until the law catches up with this, there's really ethical considerations that at some point will become legal considerations. And there's two aspects to the legal protections that AI is sort of bumping up against. One that I think has been discussed and debated much more than the other is about racial and ethnic bias. So if we're looking for the ideal Amazon employee, and we do facial recognition analysis or nonverbal analysis or textual analysis of what people say, if the ideal person at Amazon, the best performers, are members of a certain demographic group, then the software will tend to select and positively evaluate people who look like that profile. Maybe I'm from a culture that doesn't think you should be particularly emotive. Maybe I'm from a culture that thinks you should be super emotive. And maybe the software comparing me to a typical North American norm group thinks I'm under emotional, flat affect, or over emotional, tempestuous, etc. That can mean that there's discrimination against me because of my cultural background. And there's been legislation introduced in Congress about auditing AI to make sure that there isn't systematic bias. But the thing that Tomas and I and others have written about is the privacy implications, which haven't yet received as much attention as some of the racial, ethnic, and demographic aspects of the new technologies.
To follow up on these points that Ben just made, I think, historically, at least scientists and researchers, they obsessed over accuracy, which really ended up having or self-imposing some limitations, because if all of the science focuses so much on whether a tool predicts an outcome, and of course, whether the tool can be deployed in an ethical way, you're really detaching yourself from some of the main concerns or preoccupations that actual HR practitioners have, which is this tool simple? Is it quick? Is it cheap? Do I need to get a PhD in data science to understand it? So this actually explained the prevalence of some tools that have not received a lot of empirical support within the scientific literature, like the MBTI or Myers-Briggs, which have cult-like following among practitioners because there's a very nicely designed training course. It's quick, it's cheap, it's simple, and it's horoscopic, right? So some of us might identify with being Scorpio or Libra, and a lot of people like the notion of being INTJ. That had already identified a gap between things that practitioners love and things that scientists approve or endorse. And I think technology has widened that gap, where a lot of the tools that we're seeing deployed now, video-based interviews or data scraping, AI, predictive black box, game-based assessments, they didn't have to pass the high standards of accuracy that we historically use to test or vet traditional tools. And as Ben was saying, it can be accurate and yet create a lot of other problems. Maybe it's not ethical, it's not legal. So our concern is that organizations and leaders don't get in trouble for not understanding the potential implications. And yet it is also safe to remind people that there are a lot of very, very robust and well-defined ethical guidelines in place already that should be applied to these new tools. So, for example, if there is informed consent and people opt in and you protect and safeguard their data and anonymity, and you give them feedback, and you test whether the scores are predictive and even have adverse impact or not, whether there is bias in the assessments. All those parameters can be applied not just to new tools, but tools that haven't even been invented today. So it's important to actually respect the principles that are in place. And in some instances, as Ben was saying, we're going to need for laws and regulations to catch up. But in others, let's not get ourselves into thinking that this is the Wild West, because we actually have a lot of good guidelines, ethical guidelines, laws, and regulations that protect employees and employers.
And one of the things that I think we keep in mind in how we think about this is human capital, just like other kinds of investing. And, you know, for 50 years, it's been pretty well established that unless you're doing unethical things and using insider information or utilizing some kind of cutting edge technology, you're not going to beat the stock market if you're a mutual fund manager. And most fund managers underperform the index. Now, every organization and every HR department and every consulting firm says, we can help you find the best candidates. Our interviewing methodology works. And it's just logically and statistically impossible that every organization out there is beating its index as far as human capital evaluation and predictions. And sometimes when we talk to clients, we say that if we were to just bring a coin and to flip a coin with your candidates who pass a certain threshold, or to Tomas's point, if we were to use horoscopes, those horoscopes and that coin toss might actually reduce the bias in your hiring system. If there's systemic bias, random bias can actually counteract that systemic bias. So for whatever reason, you're hiring people who are taller or shorter, or who were born east of the Mississippi versus west of the Mississippi, and there's a bias in the system. In that way, if you introduce a coin toss or an invalid psychometric test or a horoscope, over the long term, you actually might have less bias in your selection system.
And that is a really important point. And you know, to reiterate one of the points you made, Ben, that with the examples of Amazon and Microsoft and companies that had trained algorithms to predict who succeeds in a certain role, and you know, they mostly then ended up selecting or recruiting or recommending middle-aged white male engineers for a certain role, because that was true. This is the profile that mostly succeeded. That, I think, is a wonderful reminder that sometimes we're very quick to point the finger at algorithms and blame AI of being biased, when in fact, these methods and tools and data are actually exposing or highlighting systemic bias that exists in the organization. If you don't use AI or chatbots or algorithms in those contexts, middle-aged white male engineers will still get promoted, you know? And so the irony there is that you could train AI to ignore whether somebody's male or female, what their age is, whether they're engineer or not, and just look at the qualities that are more fairly distributed and don't have adverse impact, and they will successfully identify somebody who could be or should be good for the role, but then they might get rated low because they're not a middle-aged white male engineer, right? Which is a bit like creating AI to scrape an algorithm that effectively selects somebody because they are honest, they have integrity, they have social skills, etc. But because then they're not attractive, or they're not young, or they're not female or white, they don't get high ratings. So I think, Ben, I don't know if you agree with this, but the biggest opportunity on the selection and recruitment side of things is to make sure that you debias your measures of performance to begin with.
Exactly, or even define the measures of performance in the first place. Everybody's focused on the independent variables, but rarely do people talk about the dependent variables. So for example, a large law firm engaged my firm, Dattner Consulting, to do a talent analytics project and analysis to try to figure out. Some of the partners said, I would rather have the student who graduated last in her class at Yale Law School than the woman who graduated first in her class at Suffolk University or at Northeastern or at a less selective or prestigious law school. And so some of the partners, mainly those who went to Yale or Harvard or places like that, believed I'd rather have the last person at a top tier law school. and the people who had gone to other schools, such as Suffolk or Northeastern, said, give me the one who graduated first in her class there. So the firm said, help us resolve that question, help us investigate that question. And what we found in looking at about 700 or 800 different attorneys is that it really wasn't possible to answer the question, that there was a range of distributions for people from the bottom of the top tier classes and the top of the lower tier classes. But as far as what the performance metric is, did somebody make partner? Not a large enough data set. How much were their billings at the firm? Too much noise based on which department they were in, or whether they were litigation, or whether they were corporate, or whether there'd been busyness in a particular geography in a given year. And also there was discussion and debate about what the soft metrics were to evaluate people's success, and how do you take into account firm citizenship and representing the firm well externally, and recruiting people and things like that. So sometimes the answer is that there isn't even an answer, which to some extent can validate any kind of selection methodology that you use, because there isn't a right answer. Organizations, going back to the human capital versus capital analogy, if you went to a company like Fidelity or Vanguard, and they were pitching a mutual fund to you, and they said, yeah, this mutual fund outperforms the market, et cetera. And we have a team of investment professionals. And if you sort of gently asked, do you track who supports which investment, or who proposes which investment, or who votes on which investment, so that there's some feedback loop of accountability? If Fidelity said, no, we don't really know who makes the decision, whether it's an individual or a group, and what the weightings are, and whether it's majority or plurality or unanimity, we don't really track those decision rules. I think you'd be very reluctant to invest in that fund, because you wouldn't think that there would be feedback mechanisms and learning and accountability over time. Yet sadly, in most organizations, there's very little accountability for who thought we should hire this person, and who made what prediction about this person's success at the organization. So there's kind of a broken accountability loop, which to some extent makes it hard for organizations to enhance their human capital practices over time. But unfortunately, there's also a benefit to that, which is that people aren't held accountable and can't be accused of bias, and they're not on the hook. And then if somebody's successful, everybody can say, I always knew she was going to be a star. And if somebody doesn't do well, I really had my doubts about him.
And Ben, do you think it's possible to really, at the level of white collar, skilled jobs in the knowledge economy, and sort of the cognitive elite of workers, or people who are highly skilled and well educated, is it possible to measure their performance in more objective ways, and sort of debias or decontaminate the political factor or element there? I'm just thinking, basically, if you hire a management consultant or an executive search, professional, or a CEO, so much of their success seems dependent on kind of soft behaviors or intangible, non-observable things. So what do you think could be done there to improve that?
Yep. Well, I think it varies by industry, and it also varies by kind of company. But certainly there are some kinds of organizations like Amazon.com where it's very data-driven and very competitive and very Darwinian, where there are all kinds of metrics, or at Google, there's OKRs, objectives and key results. And those are real kind of measurement cultures. That doesn't mean that there's not also going to be an element of subjectivity to it. But defining performance can be hard, particularly in fluid, volatile situations, in the knowledge economy, when there's team-based work, and you have to feel sorry for the Nobel Prize Committee, because each year it's harder to pick out even one or a few individuals with large projects like, particle accelerators or genomic sequencing. It's very hard to say these 1, 2, or 3 people were the ones who deserve the credit for this particular thing. And the same is true in the workplace. So it's something that has to be kind of continuously reevaluated. And also there's the question of like internal politics and internal evaluation of success versus what customers say. what's your Uber rating versus what does your supervisor at Uber think about you? Those might be quite different.
And I remember you and I in the early days of this kind of AI revolution in the talent space, had a conversation over a coffee where we talked about, something that was concerning a lot of the big companies at the time. So the big professional services and consulting firms. I remember this was maybe 10 years ago, were already running sessions, workshops for their trainees and graduate recruitment programs in their induction week, where they would advise them how to behave on Facebook, what to say, what not to say, what pictures of them to post and not. Basically, because managing their personal brand and reputation, even back then, it has gotten a lot more intense since then, would indirectly impact Deloitte, McKinsey, KPMG, Goldman Sachs, etc. Which led us to consider the scenario that we covered in our last HBR article. To what degree is it possible to trick or game these new AI-based methods? To what degree can people be trained to curate their digital persona in a way that is maybe not so authentic, but more beneficial to their career? And whether if this keeps going the trend, the direction that it has been going, we'll be in a situation where we'll be told always managing impressions and faking good, and so our life will seem like every minute on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok. And so what is your we've discussed this back then, we wrote about it recently. What should people know, and what should organizations know about our ability to distort, curate, and influence our digital records and persona?
Right. Well, particularly during the pandemic, when everybody's impression of each other is electronic, you have to think that the electronic breadcrumbs you leave are going to be things that organizations take into account. So even if it took you, for example, if it took you an hour to finish a 5K fun run, the organization might interpret that you're slow and out of shape and, not healthy or vigorous enough to do the job or to perform well, or things like that. So it's a bit of an arms race, if you will, between organizations which are trying to make determinations about people and people who are trying to put forth the right impressions of themselves. So one of the things we talked about was a Cambridge University study that said people who like curly French fries tend to be more intelligent. Once everybody finds out that that's an indicia of you being more intelligent, you can be sure that people will put forth their curly fry recipes and pictures of them eating curly fries at picnics and stuff like that. And therefore it stops being as good of an indicator. So in that sense, it's also a bit like the financial markets, where you can have a trading edge if you have an edge in terms of the data that you can gather and interpret. But once it becomes known that CEOs who wear purple ties during the annual shareholders meeting tend to outperform, you can be sure that everybody's going to wear a purple tie when they do that.
Yep, I've been eating curly fries since the study came out, but my IQ is still the same. So I'm somewhat disappointed by the lack of causality there. So I guess the other issue that is quite interesting there is that there's a lot of scientific research showing that stuff that ordinarily we consider noise, or even an indicator of undesirable behaviors, or something that we love to, in a pretty hypocritical sense, condemn or punish when we say, oh, X person isn't authentic or they're not being real. Ben, you're not the real you right now, right? Actually, if you look at the scientific research, it indicates that the ability to put on a good repertoire that acknowledges that you're aware of the social etiquette, and basically you're adjusting your behavior to censor your unfiltered and uninhibited version of you. That's something most organizations should want. And that is actually something that distinguishes good performers from bad performers. So How do you see this being manifest in coaching? I know you spend a lot of time, coaching people. To what degree do you coach people to self-censor, repress their dark side or their true self? And how do you see this transferring in the digital world now that we're all constantly in this very weird environment of Zoom?
Yeah, great question. So, it's interesting. This is politically incorrect, but I had a client who said, whenever I'm hiring a salesperson, what I do is I look at how attractive their significant other is. And if the person has an attractive, desirable significant other, you know that he or she was able to sell themselves to a, quote, desirable other person. So again, politically correct and not particularly legal, but the kind of bias that people use. But certainly my coaching clients have asked me to look at videos, if they're CEOs or CFOs, look at the transcripts of their earning calls and think, what message am I conveying? What message do I want to convey? What's my brand? And how will that impact how investors, counterparties, adversaries, job candidates, government regulators, activist investors, or whoever it is that I think may be customers, may be monitoring me in order to make determinations, what messages am I giving? And there's a term called behavioral leakage, which is, and whenever I'm working with a client, you think about what is that person saying, and also what are they not saying? So I have one client, for example, a CEO, who has gotten feedback that he seems to care more about customers and investors than he cares about employees. Right now, sometimes it's because you can see his facial expressions or his tone of voice or how he avoids questions about employees or minimizes or skims over questions about employees. But even the fact that he doesn't talk about employees, but he talks about the vision of customers, or investors and shareholder returns and stuff like that. Sometimes it can be what somebody says versus what they don't say. And what message are they giving? So I have one client, for example, a woman at a technology company. And the feedback that I gave her, which was tough feedback, but which I think she found very helpful, was that she seemed to come across as, I'm here to serve the audience. This large tech company is here to meet your needs, as opposed to, you guys should be lucky to be working with us because we have amazing technological capabilities and it's a privilege to get on our platform. And, you need to come to us with why we should collaborate with you rather than vice versa. And, there's always kind of an interesting balance of power between organizations. I've also given people feedback, you recently got promoted, you haven't been a CEO before, you're still talking like you're the head of marketing, or you're still talking like the CFO, or you're still talking like, one bit of feedback I've often given to CEOs and other C-level executives who are new in their roles is, it seems like you're auditioning for the job that you already have, right? You're kind of making the case for yourself. You don't need to do that. You're now in the seat. Now you need to think about what other messages are you sending. And particularly in the world with the war for talent and millennials and stuff like that, for our HR viewers, you're no longer simply buying other people's time, you're also selling jobs to them. And sometimes I've gotten feedback from HR clients, give coaching to the CEO, because look at this flat affect, look at how he or she is coming across. When people see this video, they think he or she is only business and it's totally serious and that we're a very traditional, ossified culture. We want to give the CEO or other senior level executives coaching to be dynamic, to be a place that millennials want to work, to sell them on the jobs, to make this seem exciting and to build passion for this. And getting feedback about that, particularly from somebody who doesn't work in the organization and isn't viewed through the prism of organizational politics and priorities, can be very helpful.
And so this takes us to, the other, I think, important or big topic, which is feedback. And, I think more and more organizations, leaders, managers, and employees, I think, are becoming aware of the importance that feedback has for their development, for their success. Of course, within IO psychology and the academics, we've known this for a while, but I think it is true if you see that there are deliberate and quite systematic attempts today to try to democratize feedback, democratize coaching, make tools like 360 a little bit more prevalent, look for proxies or kind of shortcuts that can give you a sense of how others see you. I think a couple of days ago, I saw a good tweet by Adam Grant that I can't remember exactly, but it said something like you should treat others as a mirror. If you ignore them and you don't look at people at all and how they see you, you probably won't look very, very good. But if you're looking at yourself in the mirror all the time, they'll think that you are a fake or a narcissist, right? So, which was interesting because it suggested some level of curvilinear or nonlinear effects between how much you worry about what others think of you and the impressions they give you back. But to me, the real opportunity for AI and technology is to fill in some of that white space or that gap that exists today, that accounts for the differences in how we see ourselves and how others see us, right? So if traditional psychological assessments like personality and IQ tests didn't really succeed at becoming the universal currency for predicting your performance and matching you to jobs, we could say that 360s are not going to become a mass tool used by everyone. So could AI and technology, fill in some of that space, that empty space, which is again what we wrote about in our latest HBR article? To what degree can we expect these algorithms or these companies that own the data to actually give us back some understanding or help us? I'm just even thinking about scenarios that are not quite there today. If I spend all of my lockdown days watching Tiger King, what does it say that about me? I mean, am I just like everyone else? Do I have some kind of unfulfilled, morbid, fast food-like curiosity that needs to be said? Am I just avoiding deeper questions about the meaning of life? What does it say about me if on a certain day I always listen to very sad music? And what does it mean if, to use your example again, if I have a very low Uber rating, compared to in the days where we used to take Uber more often, I remember at some point, in dinner parties saying, oh, my rating, people would boast about their ratings. And I would say, my rating is 4.7. And then I realized that actually everyone else, much like in a 360, is 4.8, 4.9, or 5. And then does it mean I have low EQ? I'm antisocial, and so on. So what is your sense of, if you fast forward 10 or 20 years, will we see the field advance or mature in that direction?
Well, certainly people are going to want more control over their data. There's going to be easier diagnostics about what your public profile says about yourself. And hopefully people will be more mindful about curating their online presence. But when it comes to HR, I think back to the point about what defines performance, whatever the selection predictors or methodologies are, HR really needs to keep the business or the organization focused on what does good performance look like. And also HR, I find, tries to be in the vanguard of making a company more innovative and saying we need different kinds of candidates, diverse demographically, diverse points of view, et cetera. And so HR can use technology to make the case for why it makes sense to be as diverse as your customer base is, or to not have people who are all the same personality type so that there's discussion and debate within the organization so it can be adaptive. So, we try to partner with HR to make organizations more adaptive. And to the point about feedback, sometimes I work with HR clients to get feedback from candidates who receive offers, but who don't accept them, right? So everybody knows about exit interviews. When somebody leaves an organization, you interview him or her and you get feedback. What was it like working here? Your net promoter score, would you recommend somebody else come work here? But what about if there's the war for talent? You make offers to very talented people, they get the offers and then they don't accept them. What can HR learn and what can HR help the business learn based on that? And as an outside consultant, sometimes I ask, what was it that changed your mind? Sometimes the comp wasn't high enough, sometimes the geography wasn't desirable, but sometimes it's, one hiring manager had one vision of the role and another had another one, or nobody asked me about innovation, or nobody asked me if I had any questions for them, or it seemed like the business model hadn't been revisited in 20 years. You can get that feedback. HR and an outside consultant or researcher can then get that feedback into the organization to say, maybe we need to train our interviewers. Maybe we need to have a more diverse group of interviewers. Maybe we have to think about what kinds of candidates we're looking at, how we're pitching it to them, and what our overall employer brand is. What's the value proposition of working here? How do we enhance that value proposition? And how do we communicate that value proposition as well?
So maybe in the future, hiring managers or boards will deliberately look for someone with a very low Uber rating, because they need somebody who speaks up, disagrees, drives some, entrepreneurial kind of mindset, and is a very results-oriented rather than an empathetic, people-centered leader or manager, right? So that's a good reminder that, and I think that often happens. It's one of the common criticisms or objections that people make when you tell them that you can measure something and there is a way to identify potential or predict performance, is like, oh, but then we're going to end up with everyone the same, and everyone, you're going to end up with just like a cult, basically. It's going to be a lot of group thing, everyone, no diversity, whatever. And first of all, that's what we have right now in general. So that's actually, even without assessment, that tends to happen more often than we want. And secondly, absolutely not. Just because you measure something doesn't mean that you have to always go for the same, right? So in fact, if you want to have variety, you need to be able to measure human diversity so that you end up with people who think, act, and feel differently, which is why, I think tools, assessments, and data provide an opportunity to improve over the current state of affairs, right? Fundamentally, I think my biggest hope for HR as a profession or as a field, and I think the biggest opportunity for HR to upgrade itself and continue to evolve and advance, is to have the humility and self-criticism to distrust its own instincts and pay more attention to data. Of course, science-based tools are preferable to hocus pocus, gizmos or overhyped gadgets, but we are still on that journey, I think.
Right. And, to put in a plug for Tomas's best-selling book, Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders? In the current environment, particularly in the blogosphere and the Twitter sphere, there's a big difference between leader emergence and leader effectiveness. And that's one thing that we always suggest HR keep in mind, which is, candidate emergence, if you will, and being appealing to the organization versus their effectiveness once they actually come on board might be quite different. Again, going back to the law firm, somebody was last in their class at Yale Law School, and that credential makes them emerge as a compelling candidate. That does not necessarily mean that they're going to be the best performing legal associate. Exactly.
And I know you and I discussed a recent book that was very interesting, The Meritocracy Trap. And I know you also spoke to the author and had a good exchange. I think that's a really, fundamentally a very interesting question. The fact that you could actually make systematic and significant improvements in your ability to hire for talent, for potential, and actually it would make the world less meritocratic in a sense, or the fact that meritocracy might not be so meritocratic, right? Or that there is a, clear hereditary or kind of non-tabula rasa component to meritocracy, and which is very, very interesting, right? Because if I think organizations are simultaneously trying to find the best and create a diverse and inclusive culture, there could always be a tension there. And I think that tension is most clear around social class. It even transcends age, race, and gender.
There's also theory emergence versus theory effectiveness, right? So Malcolm Gladwell is a great writer. And in his book Outliers, he says, 10,000 hours of practice Look at the Beatles. They had 10,000 hours of practice. I guarantee you, if I practiced music for 10 million hours or 10 million years, I would never be as good as the Beatles. So we would all like to believe that effort makes a difference, but to think somebody has God-given or universe-given talents and genius, you know, is something that in our cultural zeitgeist isn't particularly politically palatable. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true, right? And one of the cultural wars that we're having, particularly on university campuses, is there's one group who believes every hypothesis should be open to testing, discussion, and debate. But in the current political environment, and there have been some, I won't name names, but university presidents who've made statements about data-driven hypotheses that they thought were worth testing, and there was a backlash, and they were removed from their presidencies of some pretty prestigious university because that can't be discussed in debate. And I'm not weighing in to say it should be or it shouldn't be. I'm just saying that these things are particularly fraught in the current era that we live and work in, and organizations need to be mindful of the political context. So I'm here right now in New York City. There's a political debate about the standardized tests that kids take to get into high schools. And some people say it should be the top 5% of scorers across the city, even if the people who do best on the test are members of one or few demographic groups, and people who are overrepresented in the high school population are underrepresented. They should say it should just be merit-based. Other people say, no, it should be the top 5% of kids within each district or within each school, which would then yield a very different composition of students in the high school. So that is a political and societal decision about what are we optimizing for. But you know, the meritocracy trap basically says that, you know, we shouldn't say that there's some God-given right to say just because, you know, it's the top 5% of the scorers that somehow means it's not political, that's just, you know, nature's law or democracy or competition or something like that. That's an intrinsically political decision. And to say that, you know, something is just the default, so therefore it's not political, it's just the status quo. I think what we're seeing in all the turmoil and protests in our society is to say, you know, the naturalistic fallacy, just because something is something doesn't mean it ought to be that way, or just because something ought to be that way doesn't mean it is that way. There have to be discussions and debates about that stuff. And it's inescapable that there's a political aspect to it. Any selection methodology you use theoretically is going to benefit one group at the expense of another, or one different set of groups. Now you have to keep in mind anti-discrimination laws, but to the point of horoscopes, if we're choosing between two 35-year-old white men and we say we want a Capricorn and not a Sagittarius, that's completely legal to do. There is no law saying you can't do that.
It's hard to go beyond the descriptive element or the predictive or explanatory element of any assessment tool, old or new, right? And if this is kind of murky and somewhat wishy-washy in the social sciences, it's incredible that the same applies even to some of the natural sciences. I mean, there's basically nothing is immune to this. I mean, if you go outside of our field of talent and HR for a minute and look at how data has been politicized in the context of the health crisis and the pandemic, you know, just look at very simple indicators or simple variables like, should we wear a mask or not, right? And over the course of the last 4 months, if you pick a single place, it can be more or less wealthy, more or less educated, etc., you will see a big switch in rhetoric, behavior, etc. And let's face it, the data hasn't changed that much. We always had access to the same information, the same studies. I remember reading some of the early meta-analysis, the reviews of all the studies that said, well, it's if everyone wears a mask, there is a 10 or 15% benefit to that. And that study was ignored because it was too nuanced, and who cares about that, right? But that, I think, is if this happens at the highest level of leadership and government, etc., you can see how, if you look at the more mundane, everyday example of a manager needs to pick between two candidates, they're going to go for the Capricorn if they want to, or the Sagittarius if they want to. And I think you are alluding to the current debate on cancel culture, which I think is really interesting, at least if you interpret it or connect it to the wider kind of the bigger picture, which is, we've had the latest or some of the latest police brutality that led to race protests and unrest, probably fueled by the crisis, etc. And then you saw advertisers removing, sponsorship from Facebook and accusing Facebook and big tech of kind of fueling hate speech. And then you saw Steven Pinker and a lot of kind of intellectuals saying, there's freedom of speech, right? And the article that really stuck to me was, I think, in The Guardian a few weeks ago, where they were talking about how it's okay to have a little bit of friction, and that's not, we all prefer the rational discussion, but there's always going to be some emotional volatility. But what stuck with me about the article was that it starts describing a statue to George Orwell in front of the BBC building in London, and it says that it's a quote from Animal Farm, I think, that says, you cannot have freedom in society unless you tell people what they hate to hear and what they don't want to hear. And even if you take that line, I think, it made perfect sense in 1930s or 1940s, right? And maybe you could argue there are parallels now, but it's a very interesting definition of whether that is freedom or that is just, an invitation to live in a very antisocial society where we insult each other, So I think, to me, the paradoxical issue is that the intellectuals are, I think, trying to cancel culture, which is a bit of a loop as well.
Speaking of statues, there was a piece in The Onion, heavily armed militia surrounds statue of Yogi Bear in case he was associated with Confederacy.
I saw that. Yeah, I saw that. Well, any final thoughts? So I think, where I guess if I were watching this with an HR kind of background, SHRM professional, I think, my main question would be, what is our most practical advice or, take home message for them to go back to their jobs and improve what they're doing with what we try to tell them?
So I would say go to HBR, search for our names, and look at the articles we've written separately and together. And there's a lot of guides to psychometric testing, thinking about selection assessment, AI, interview scorecards, things like that. There's a lot of resources there, and also on our respective websites.
And we'll share links to those articles as well and our websites. It would have been nice to be in person, obviously, especially given the venue. Unfortunately, some unexpected outside events forced us to switch to this format. But thanks everyone for watching. Thank you, Ben, and it's been a pleasure.
And we look forward to interacting with everybody during the sessions.